The City of Annapolis primary election is Tuesday, September 16th. Polls will be open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., and if you are in line by 8, you will still be able to vote. There is no Republican primary this year, as all Republican candidates are unopposed and will advance to the November general election. On the Democratic side, there are contested races for mayor and in wards 1, 3, 4, and 6. If you received a mail-in ballot, it must be received, not just postmarked by 4:30 p.m. on September 12th. Ballots can be mailed, dropped in an official drop box, delivered to City Hall, or taken to your polling place on Election Day. Ion Annapolis offered every candidate in a challenge race the opportunity to speak with us. We reached out to each campaign 3 times. Each candidate was asked these same questions, and their answers are presented here, unedited and in their own words. No one received the questions in advance, and in fairness, all of these conversations are being released at the same time. We do plan to do something similar for the general election once the ballot is set. Please have a listen to each of these candidates so you can make an informed vote. Well, on the phone today is Katie McDermott, who is a I screwed that up. Okay. On the phone with us today is Katie McDermott, who is running for Alderwoman, in Ward 1, which is the historic area of Annapolis and the surrounding areas. She is in a 6-way race, 5 ways in the primary, and we wanted to touch base and see her thoughts on various issues throughout the city and Ward 1 that are important to the voters. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, Katie.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a big fan of Ion Annapolis.
Well, thank you. Let's get right into it. I mean, city dock resiliency and flooding. Annapolis is moving forward with that major city dock resiliency project to protect downtown from the frequent flooding and sea level rise. Do you support that current city dock plan? And I guess, how would you ensure its success if elected?
John, I've been, honestly, writing a lot on the city dock proposal for the last two years at least. I'm very concerned about the current plan. The amenities is the biggest issue. I think most folks support resiliency and turning a parking lot into a park. But I think the way that this has gone about has been more mission creep. And we've gone from $42 million to almost $100 million on the cost of resiliency and the entire project. And I just know in my experience that that's not going to have an easy ending for us, fiscally or even in the quality of the work. And there's been a lot of drama around the Maritime Welcome Center, which I did oppose. And I am a little bit different than Historic Annapolis, which did compromise and agree to a smaller building. But I honestly feel that building on the water in a treacherous flood zone is just not a good public policy decision. And spending anywhere from 10 to 20 million in that area to make it an entertainment area is just not the wisest use of public resources, energy, and we've just got a lot of more important priorities. And I think this concern has run headlong into the funding issue, because I think there was an expectation that we would have FEMA money, and we may still get that. It's quite possible. But there is, to me, a problem with, expecting that bond grant funding is going to save the day. And I'm skeptical of that. And I'm skeptical of the ongoing maintenance. And I think the last issue, John, that I've written about and believe to this day is that it doesn't reflect the right priorities for this city. And when we have so many challenging needs, we are spending an enormous focus, $100 million focus on this tiny area of the city. And only a tiny part of it is actually resiliency. And I think it's a misjudgment. And so I would have liked to have seen them focus differently. And I feel there was very little oversight over this project, particularly from the city council. And so I think we're going to have some rough sledding over the next few years trying to figure out how to finish that project and who's really paying for it.
Fair. I want to shift over into crime and public safety a little bit, but several neighborhoods are facing many public safety challenges. And I know in 2024, for instance, Ward 7 actually was one of the worst for violent crimes. They had a homicide, 2 rapes, and multiple robberies. City officials have said that thefts from unlocked vehicles citywide, they've discussed solutions as better street lighting, community policing to deter crime. What do you think we need to do to improve public safety in Annapolis? And I guess that would be both for residents and for visitors.
Yeah, both can be affected. And I have this is another area I've been outspoken on for the last few years. First, you have to acknowledge you have a crime problem, and we have a violent crime problem. Annapolis has been identified as high risk for homicide by gun violence, and yet communities, 5 miles away, are low or no risk for the same type of offenses. So we know we've got a problem, and we know our vulnerable communities are disproportionately affected. And I think that the public safety mission can't really address issues unless they acknowledge that reality. And I was pretty happy. I wouldn't say happy is the right word to use, honestly. But in the 2025 report is the first time I've seen them acknowledge an uptick in violent crime. And I think that's step one to being able to identify good solutions. And I have participated in public safety forums that Jared Littman held earlier this year, and I've actually drafted a white paper for him on the crime issues. And one is, I think, working much more closely with our federal and state partners on identifying crime and whether the crime is organic, coming from our community, or actually folks coming into our community, and if so, what's attracting them. So basically a baseline causation analysis that frankly could be shared with communities would be important. It's also clear to me that we've got to assure that we're doing good training, particularly on mental health crisis protocols. And I, was very concerned about what happened with a woman who was arrested at City Hall for overnight sleeping and eating $4.49 Hot Pockets out of the employee fridge. And I'm like, what are we focused on here? And I was troubled by the raids that occurred with the help of the federal partners for a lot of the drug deals, and terrific indictments came out of that. And but the conduct was so blatant, I just had to wonder why anyone thought they could do drug deals on a bench under a TV camera. And so that tells me there may not be the presence in these communities that there needs to be to detect and prevent crime. And our public housing areas are vulnerable communities that need to have a higher presence. And when I read the 2025 report, I saw that there was focus on these issues. So I'm optimistic that there can be progress here, and I think there has to be.
Housing costs are a growing concern for many Annapolitans. Many Maryland voters have ranked housing affordability as their number one concern, above even taxes and crime. And a statewide survey actually found 42% of the younger renters are considering leaving the state due to the high cost of housing. What are your thoughts to make Annapolis more affordable to live in or rent in or own in?
Well, I think you've got to address this as a neighborhood type of issue. So I think short-term rentals have definitely impacted the long-term rental market. If it's easier and more lucrative to rent in a transient visitor than versus a long-term renter, then you're going to, disrupt the market for long-term renters. And so I think that's a number one issue that's got to be addressed. I also think for when we look at our public housing, we obviously have to look at the class action settlement, but we also have to look at whether it's wise to have an expectation that folks will stay in public housing long term or even in a multi-generational way. And I know other counties, Anne Arundel County does have a voucher program. I know Howard County has a strong voucher program. What can we do to bridge the gap to have people economically integrating our neighborhoods and providing some opportunity to be in a home that they can afford with some assistance? And so I think that is worthwhile to explore as well. I don't think that just increasing housing in our 7 square miles is wise, because we're at a density area that I just don't think accommodates that. And I've noticed that a lot of the buildings, apartment buildings, just over the line of the city in the county are luxury apartment buildings, and they may have a short-term designation of affordable housing, but it's not making a dent in affordable housing at all. So I think you have to be very targeted that you want to meet that market, and then look at the county as an area of building affordable housing, not just simply in the city. A lot of these proposals for affordable housing seem to look at the city as solving the problem by themselves, when that's just not going to be possible. So we've got to partner with the county and the state to bring affordable housing solutions near the city, not just in the city.
Let's talk about business and economic development. And our economy really relies heavily on tourism and government, which has contributed to a bit of inequality. I mean, the government and churches really don't pay any taxes. And the city has developed a reputation that it is just so difficult to do business here. And some people have actually said, I'm never spending money in this town again. What are your ideas to make the city a little bit more business friendly, yet still preserving the charm and character that the tourism is built on?
Well, I think you've got to manage the tourism honestly for the residents. And I think that will help the small business community, because some have suggested to me that they're not really benefiting from the tourism because they're not coming into their particular shops. So I think there's got to be some analysis of that. But I would like to see the visitors, use our garages more, use our circulator more, expand it maybe to Eastport, and preserve the neighborhoods for the residents so they can be walking downtown and want to come downtown again to all the shops that they love. And I think that would help the business community significantly.
Well, tied in with that, I mean, you talked about the circulators there as well, but traffic congestion and parking shortages, specifically the garage, um, and especially during tourist season as well as certain events for them, they're perennial problems here in Annapolis. Our public transit options are limited. Residents often complain about the difficulty in getting around. And in a recent mayoral debate, actually, they were asked about their ideas to improve public transportation over the next 4 years. But what are your thoughts on improving mobility in the city and perhaps solving this parking garage woes with all the different apps that we have to use to navigate parking?
Well, I go by Hillman Garage daily, and it'll say 422 spaces available. So do we really have a parking problem? What we have is an incentive problem. And the reason residents can't get around is because they can't park near their home, which they should be able to do. And we've got to get visitors to use our garages, because why is Hillman empty? And I'm always hearing anecdotally that Hillman's making money, but that doesn't mean it's a well-managed asset to manage tourism and the resident interests. And so that would help mobility getting around. But people got to be able to park near their home, and they can then, if they want to, walk where they want to go. But if they can't get around the city, then that's very difficult. And if they can't park, that's very difficult. But I see the parking issue as more as a resident issue and less so a visitor issue, because they don't seem to be using our garages to capacity. And that's detracting from the availability of parking for residents. And I think other issues involved with getting around, and I do drive. I don't bike everywhere. And honestly, I'm not going to bike everywhere. This idea that everybody should have a bike and bike everywhere, I don't think is realistic, particularly where a lot of folks commute to work, several miles away. So we're going to have cars. And I think we've got to manage downtown pedestrian and car traffic, because a lot of the backup is related to how we're managing pedestrian crosswalks, just to my observation. So I would like to see that improve for mobility in high event times, and Sunday afternoon and on the weekends and things like that. I think that would be helpful. So those are some of the initial thoughts I have on that.
Fantastic. Well, the city government doesn't really control the schools, which are actually sort of run by the county. Our leaders can still have an impact on education and youth in Annapolis. And how would you support educational opportunities and youth programs within the city?
Well, I think that also relates to a little bit of the crime issue too. You've got to have youth engagement, and Some of the crime incidents have reflected youth involvement, and on the parks and recreation side, we spend 400,000 on pickleball night lights, but it's not clear, our ball fields are supported for youth recreation. So I'm a big proponent. I grew up, playing tennis on public courts, so of course I love that. But we need to be able to have strong recreation after school engagement programs for youth. And I think that making that available, particularly on a transportation side, should be a major focus.
City residents do expect open and ethical government. And as actually stated in Annapolis ethics guidelines, it's, quote, holding the public trust requires maintaining high ethical standards, unquote. How are you going to promote transparency and accountability from your desk at City Hall? Because I don't think they give you guys offices. So we'll call it a desk.
That's okay. I mean, I can work anywhere. So where you work isn't the issue. It's the information you're given to do your job. And when I look at the city staff reports, that when you get on the website and you start clicking on a bill, it'll have a fiscal note, a staff report, and things like that. And they're just devoid of information. And I think that's very serious. And when I look at, for example, the hotel bill or some of the bond financing or the city dock related activities, there just aren't the facts in there for the public to be informed. And, we constantly have to get on YouTube and watch hours and hours of hearing just to understand what's happening. And I don't think that's practical for the average citizen. And I think that is a burden, a justifiable burden on someone who is an alderman or alderwoman to notify and educate their constituents on what's happening. But I have noticed that they're a little handicapped in that because the facts don't seem to be there. And I remember when Ellie, who was very responsive to constituents, was our alderwoman, there were a lot of times she didn't have the facts and she was frustrated. And so I think we've got to, up the game on getting information to city council members and publishing information to the public. And also, the way agendas are run. On July 28th, it was a blockbuster agenda. You had the hotel, the market house lease, this bond financing, which included the city dock project, which has not been explained, and a whole bunch of other important things just all loaded up on the runway. It was overwhelming just for me trying to keep up. And I can't imagine the rest of the public felt well informed. And those are easy things to fix if you care about getting public input. But I think there's been almost a strategy of not giving us the right information at the right time to be well informed. And I want to work really hard on that, in addition to the city council's oversight role, because they can't perform oversight if they're not getting timely information either.
The current mayor and most of the council will be leaving office in December. And there's been a lot of discussion about their legacy. Some will praise Mayor Buckley, and one mayoral candidate even said he's been one of the best mayors we've ever had. But there have also been plenty of criticisms. For example, the city dock project's cost ballooned from an initial $40 million to $50 million to now we're close to or maybe even over $100 million after adding the various amenities. We're looking for a $33 million FEMA grant to come in here and everything else. In your view, what did the outgoing administration do right, and where did they fall short?
Well, I think Gavin Buckley is a rare talent, and I think he deserves credit for many things. For example, the West Street corridor development. And I went to a lot of vigils when George Floyd happened. I went to the Peace March when you had that horrible shooting, with the kids coming off the school bus. And I really have always admired his compassion and his generosity and his caring about people. And I just don't think you can take that away from him. And I also love the focus on arts and music and, our maritime legacy. And also, telling the story of Annapolis that doesn't get told, though I think Historic Annapolis is the best at doing that. And so I give all credit in that regard. I feel his sensibility about government was immature. And the idea of informing people getting real input and making good decisions in the public interest have sometimes fallen short. And City Dock is a good example. And pushing this hotel is a good example, and so is the marina proposal. And in the beginning of his tenure, I was the first who wrote an op-ed about the bike path on Main Street, but it was really more about trying to do things without notice to the public, having no notice hearings or scheduling meetings at 2 o'clock when nobody can attend. It's just a lack of respect for governing. And I think that that's a problem. And I really hope, and I know whoever's the next mayor will improve on that. And I think that was the Achilles heel of his administration.
Let's talk a little bit about budget. Annapolis often has to do with limited resources, as we mentioned, that they don't get the tax base that they're probably entitled to with all of the state and county businesses and churches, or businesses, county resources and churches that don't pay any kind of taxes. There's always pressure to keep taxes reasonable. And we're potentially looking at a bunch of financial gaps if federal funding to the city gets cut. As a council member, where do your budget priorities lie?
Well, my budget priorities, one would be to get our fiscal house in order. I think that we have been very ambitious to do a lot of recreational things like parks, and those are good things, but we have a lot of parks that weren't taken care of, including Acton's Cove Park. And so I feel that we've got to get back to basics on the essentials of city life, and that's fixing our neglected infrastructure. And so the discretionary items, we've got to take a hard look at them and reduce them. And I did attend our budget town hall. Our alderman had a lot of input from residents on where we could cut things, including the $400,000 for pickleball lights at Truxton. And I know the pickleball folks won't like me saying that, but honestly, I feel sometimes you got to make hard decisions, and that would have been one of mine. Uh, but at the end of the day, we really do have enough revenue to run the city. And so I have supported the homestead tax credit normalization that ABC has promoted. I've worked on the petition. I'm an advisory member of ABC. And I've also worked on the nonpartisan election petition. Those are two things we agree on that I've worked on. And I feel that a sense of great concern that our fiscal house is not in order, with heavy bond funding, with uncertainty on grant funding, that this is the time to relook at our priorities and switch them away from tourist development projects more to resident projects. And I would like to see that happen.
Voters often do feel disconnected from their officials. How do you plan to engage the public and stay accountable to residents between elections?
Well, I like the approach that Ellie Tierney and Harry have had, which is to have a weekly newsletter. And I think that's very important to do that. And I've also looked at the communications that other aldermen have had, Ross Arnett and Rob Savage, have very effective but different communications with their constituents. But it appears that they are very, very open to telling the residents what's happening. And I think that's important. And one of my concerns about constituent communications is it timely? And did it occur in enough time for the residents to know about it? And that's one of the concerns I have about the hotel legislation. I don't feel the constituents were timely told that this bill is coming up. And I don't think we were timely told about the marina proposal being on the city council working session agenda. And that motivated me to start Save Our Harbor and get constituents organized to ask hard questions, because I felt that wasn't happening. And in the end, my responsibility, whether I agree or disagree with an issue, is to make sure that constituents know what's coming down the road, not the Sunday night before a Monday meeting, because they don't have any time to react or absorb. And our obligation to inform is actually greater when the complexity and volume of the issues are greater. And that's what we've seen this year. I mean, there's just been a huge number of very consequential legislative initiatives that are going to have a huge impact on residents. And it's just hard to absorb that when you learn about it last minute.
I want to slide over into some award-specific question, and each of Annapolis's 8 wards has its own unique concerns and needs. In your ward, Ward 1, what do you believe is the single most pressing issue facing that community, and how do you plan to address it?
Well, if you'd asked me a few months ago, I probably would have said the city dock. And I think we're over focused on that, even though I've demonstrated my concern publicly for 2 years now. But as I've walked around and seen neglected infrastructure, parking issues, I'd say our urgent issue is short-term rentals. They have literally crashed our neighborhoods. I've residents are reporting to me that there's a lot of illegal short-term rentals. There's 14 short-term rentals on Charles Street alone, and I know that because I've been knocking on doors, and folks are telling me. And I'm just, I guess, shocked that we let this get so out of hand and had, frankly, the lack of care and duty to our neighborhoods to even enforce the law. And that's why I urged a moratorium, an urgent, immediate moratorium. Folks can't park, the trash is a mess. And there was also a public safety issue of not knowing who the heck your neighbor is or even having a neighbor. And I met this young couple who just moved into Charles Street, and they have a short-term rental investor property on either side of them and across the street. And the gentleman said, who do you borrow a hose from? Who's going to, and I would say, who's going to help let your dog out? Because that's my neighbors help me with my dog a lot. And also my medical emergencies, by the way. I had a medical emergency a couple years ago, and I had neighbors that could rush me for testing and rush me to the emergency room. And when I got COVID, I had neighbors at the door without asking, taking my puppy. And, that's just not happening in some of our streets. And I don't think I had any clue, and I should have, about the degree in which neighborhoods have been eroded in Ward 1. And I think it's a 5-alarm fire.
And as elected, though, you obviously represent your ward's interests, but you also need to make decisions for the overall good of the city. You, in effect, represent the city as well. How do you balance the needs of Ward 1 with the needs of Annapolis as a whole?
Well, I'm not sure they're really all that different. When I look at the crime issue that is prominent in Ward 1, it's equally prominent in some other wards. So we really have a lot of common interests. When I look at the managing the tourism issue, that affects Eastport as much as it does Ward 1. And so I feel that sometimes our leaders divide us, but the reality is some of these issues have great commonality among the wards. And so I think that we've got to acknowledge our commonality and work together. And I think this city council is going to be a great opportunity for new faces with a moderating voice to start working together instead of, having this idea that, well, that's your ward, not my ward. And I think that that's very promising given the turnover in the city council. And that's not a criticism of prior city council members, but I do think, we have had a little bit from leadership of us versus them, and I just don't think that's productive. And I think Alderman Gay said it best when we were debating the city dock issues. And somebody said, well, this is a Ward 1 issue. And he said, no, it's a city issue. And we have to get this right for the whole city because the whole city is invested in what happens. And he couldn't be more correct.
I'll tell you, as we wrap it up, Katie, we've got about 14,000 people that subscribe to the podcast, whoever listens to it at Ion Annapolis and all the socials and stuff like that. But here is your chance. It's an open mic night. It's not like Stan and Joe's. There's no need to sing. But why do we need Katie McDermott as the Ward 1 Alderwoman?
You don't want me to sing when Irish eyes are smiling?
That might get it for you.
I think, Ward 1 is frankly blessed with enormous talent. And I'm not talking about just the folks running to represent us. And they're all very talented. And I like all of them. We have enormous people talent in Ward 1 that volunteer on commissions. And just even in the last few days, folks sending me their research and their position papers It would be a privilege to represent this ward. It's complex. I think it's a full-time job, but it would be enormously rewarding. And I think all of the folks that are running may feel that way and certainly have a lot of talent to offer. I think what I'm bringing to the table is one, just my longevity living in this ward. I came here in 1986 to start my legal career, but I've actually lived downtown in the historic district for 18 years, and that may be longer than any other candidate. And I've also been very active on these issues. I mean, I'm grateful that many of the candidates agree with my positions. And I've actually been working on these issues for several years and representing my community, whether it be Acton's Cove Park and getting that cleaned up, or, showing up at these city dock hearings the last few years and supporting historic preservation. So I feel like I've been in the game of representing resident interests for a long time. And after that marina proposal came and I formed Save Our Harbor, and we had this immediate reaction, I think we have 200 members, that told me that I should just keep going and see if I could get the job that I feel in a little bit I'm already doing. And that's, I think, the greatest argument that I'm making for myself, that I have been a proven advocate and I have been here long enough to know the history of these issues and maybe where we can find common ground to solve them. And at this juncture, I think the city hall needs folks to, you know, come to the city hall meetings to be energized about their government and passionate about solving these problems. And I think I can be um, a good leader on those issues and get citizens engaged in the city that we all love so much.